Hello Internet, and thanks for coming back to part 3 of our waltz through the Exorcist franchise. We've got through the choppy waters of Exorcist 2, The Heretic, and we've got a patch of clear blue sky and open sailing dead ahead. Despite the mauling that The Heretic got, Warner Brothers was still interested in another Exorcist movie. And despite reservations, William Peter Blatty got the seed of an idea, he got the germ of an idea, and I imagine that it worried at him, and him being a writer, you can't ever really put a good idea down. And according to interviews with him, he spoke to William Friedkin, director of the original film, about the idea and wanted to get him on board doing this. Friedkin, by all accounts, loved the idea, but Warner Brothers were, I would imagine, crazy about the notion of getting the writer and director of the first film back together to do a sequel. But for reasons not gone into by Blatty, and I can understand why. Who wants to tell tales out of school? But he alludes to the fact that Friedkin and he had a slight disagreement about the direction the story should go. So they parted ways. And after a purgatorial period of trying to get this movie developed himself, Blatty fell back on his old original skill set and just decided to write it as a novel. I say just decided to write it as a novel because the novel he wrote was Legion, the true sequel to The Exorcist. Now, this was published in 1983, so for all of you kids who might be watching this, try and cast your mind back to a time before the internet or news feeds or social media, where unless you were really, I guess, a member of some kind of club or fanzine, or I guess regularly read specialist magazines, you wouldn't really have any kind of advance hint that anything like this was coming along. I didn't know this existed until I saw it in a second-hand bookshop. And if you've seen my video to part 1 and how I felt getting hold of a copy of the novel of The Exorcist, this was almost like an even better kept secret. Everyone had heard of The Exorcist, but the sequel to The Exorcist? So I went home and I read this, and I can remember on first reading skipping towards the end a bit, just thinking, because it was the 80s and I was an old gorehound when it came to horror. You know what? Has this actually got anything to do with The Exorcist? I can remember skimming to one of the pages at the back and seeing the word Karas a couple of times, and then going, right, okay, I'm in safe hands here. I don't want to spoil what happens later, so I'm actually just going to keep reading in the order I'm supposed to be reading this frickin' book in. Legion follows Detective Kinderman, the policeman, on the fringes of the events of the original film, although he has a much larger part in the original novel. But some 15 years later, a series of murders occur which bear all the hallmarks of a serial killer who is known to be dead, and thus begins quite the theological detective story, whodunit. There's a lot more mystery to this novel, I think, than The Exorcist, because in The Exorcist, girl gets possessed. Who is committing these murders? What is the seeming connection to the events 15 years earlier, and the exorcism that took place in an upstairs bedroom of a house on M Street, and a priest who fell down a flight of steps to his death that fateful night? first things first, this book is really funny. It's dark. It's dark funny, but the little lilt, I would say, that Blatty's comedy dialogue has, his ear for timing is, I would say, not only present and correct, but firing on all cylinders in this book. When you get to the movie version of it, Ed Flanders and George C. Scott bring this dialogue alive, but it's all here in the original text. The comedy beats, not just the carp, for those of you who've seen the film or read the book, not just the story of the carp, but Pushkin, the notorious burglar who breaks into people's houses and rearranges their furniture. Mother India is calling you, father. The the fact that religious texts don't give you the latest fashions. These are people that I personally love spending time with. Oh my God, so and so, I forget the guy's name, our greatest benefactor. What did you say to him? I told him Jesus loves you, everyone else thinks you're an asshole. This stuff is dynamite. I love this book. There's a character in here who is completely stripped out of the novel for the movie. Understandably, I think he would have slowed the movie down, but in this novel he's very much an analogue of Damien Karras. It's a doctor in here called Amfortas, who is deeply spiritual and emotional. He's like Karras, still waters run deep with him, and he's bearing the ever-bleeding wounds of a tragic loss of a love. And there's an exploration in this book of EVP, electronic voice phenomena, I believe it's called. That crazy kooky stuff that Michael Keaton got himself tied up in the movie White Noise. Except here there's a whole section of this book that goes into his obsession with EVP. Think of it almost like a Ouija board, but with reel-to-reel tape. Remember what that is, kids? Although Amfortas is a wonderful character, there is a real kick to the gut at the end of this book with regard to that character that I'm not sure even all these decades later I can quite reconcile. It's a very nasty, almost malicious end to a character that you grow to love in this book. But you know, as Kinderman finds out throughout his career and throughout this novel, the world is red in tooth and claw, so maybe we shouldn't ever expect an entirely happy ending. Where I feel, unfortunately, the novel falls down, all the detective stuff and all the theological stuff is, and the whodunit aspect is absolutely phenomenal. Running like a thread through all of this is Kinderman's musings on whether there is a creator deity or whether to be a Darwinist, for want of a better term. There's an argument that runs through this book, which is creationism versus Darwinism, if I'm allowed to be reductive. Although for creationism it's more akin to what we would call these days the argument for intelligent design. When I first read the book, it was an amazingly powerful argument. Years and years later, reading it, it is unfortunate that Kinderman seems to set up some hollow arguments to argue against. Perhaps it's Blatty's own failing. Blatty's grasp of evolution does seem to be lacking somewhat. It doesn't matter though, because the conclusion that Kinderman comes to at the end of this novel, Legion, and none of this is in the movie, is mind-blowingly the thought that flits across Father Lancaster Merrin's mind in the first page of The Exorcist, i.e. that the Big Bang was the fall of Satan, Lucifer, and that all of creation, the entire universe, all matter and all conscience and self-consciousness and all pain and all good and all evolution is really a singular struggle of one being to fight upwards towards being in the presence of God again. It's quite a magnificent ending to the book, and it just, with a lovely circularity, brings us right back round to the first page of The Exorcist again, and round and round and round we go, and where we stop no one knows. Legion, my friends, was a bestseller, and where there is money, there is interest in a film. Not Warner Brothers this time, but Morgan Creek. Suddenly Legion itself is a proven commodity, and oh, what? Someone's written a sequel to The Exorcist and it's a bestseller? Well, gosh darn it, this thing should be a movie, surely. So the thing that Blatty was trying to get to do all along, he gets there the long way round rather than the short way round. Ladies and gentlemen, we get Exorcist III in 1990, which is the only of the original film's sequels that manages to harness the sense of threat, of dread, of existential horror. Are we alone in the universe? Does God care about us? Are we the playthings of demons and devils? And is that the better option? Because the other alternative is being completely and utterly alone and desolate in a universe of matter, pain and death, and once you're dead, you're gone. It's not the greatest option on the table, either of these. Blatty wrote a screenplay based on his novel, as he did with The Exorcist. Blatty directed this movie, and thank goodness he did. What a great director he turned out to be. I wouldn't have thought, I like The Ninth Configuration. I wouldn't have thought the guy who directed The Ninth Configuration could direct Exorcist III. Such an assured hand on the tiller. This guy knows when to go fast, when to go slow. He's so convinced of the story he's telling that he's happy to let it unfold, and he's happy to let you work to piece some of it together rather than spoon feeding you everything. You get several cast members from The Ninth Configuration, Blatty's previous and first film, returning for this. Scott Wilson, who was Billy Cutshaw in The Ninth Configuration, if you remember, the astronaut who Reagan says is going to die up there at the dinner party in The Exorcist. Scott Wilson plays that character in The Ninth Configuration and is back here as Dr. Temple, the guy who's looking after patient X in the demented ward. Ed Flanders returns from The Ninth Configuration to now play Father Dyer. And Jason Miller is a glorious return as, for some of the screen time, Patient X, the Gemini, Karas. We'll get into that a little later. And as an interesting aside, which we'll also get into a little later when we talk about the producers Morgan Creek meddling, Nicole Williamson as Father Morning, who was supposed to be Colonel Kane in The Ninth Configuration, but had to step aside or got fired or something like that. no one again wants to tell tales out of school, and that's fine. So in the ninth configuration, Stacey Keach came on board when there was a part going for Nicole Williamson. Blatty gets him on board here and gives him a job. I think that's the sign of a really stand-up guy, I'll be perfectly honest with you. Nicole Williamson, if the name doesn't ring a bell, is Merlin in Excalibur, and he's the Gnome King in the really rather excellent Return to Oz, which is a sequel that might get a defending of video for me some way down the line. As a weird little synchronous aside, Nicole Williamson as Merlin in Excalibur, that part was originally supposed to be played by Max von Sydow, our Lancaster Merrin from the first two films. So there you go. A design shapes all our means and ends. Now there's a fabled director's cut of this movie that doesn't exist. Apparently the footage doesn't exist. That is more in alignment to what Blatty wanted than Morgan Creek eventually let him have. They gave him his first cut, had a screening of it, then gave him his notes and forced him to go and do some reshoots. The closest you can come to having any kind of idea of what he originally intended is essentially to get your hands on the screenplay. This is the screenplay for The Exorcist and Legion, so this is even a screenplay for The Exorcist that was tinkered with, but the Legion screenplay is really interesting. There's a fascinating flashback to the childhood of James and Tommy Veneman, James Veneman being the Gemini killer, who essentially killed because he wanted to shame his father, a famous evangelist, Carl Veneman. So if you remember from the movie, he would only kill people whose name began with K. There's a flashback which would have made you a hell of a lot more sympathetic to the watery-eyed Brad Dourif in this. There are flashbacks in the novel that give you a little bit more of an insight into James Veneman and his motivations that just aren't there in the movie. Also, the ending is his intended ending runs pretty much parallel to how the book ends. Kinderman reaches a point where there is enough proof in front of his eyes that he says to this guy in this padded cell who can't get out, yes, I believe that you're the resurrected spirit of the Gemini killer, which is a huge step for Kinderman, who's a lifelong agnostic, I guess. And the Gemini dies, essentially, or the spirit inside the body dies and goes back through the great veil to the beyond. And we find out that he's left at the same time that the Gemini killer's father died. The Gemini's dad no longer being around, there's no one left to shame and torture with these killings, so he just leaves again. That was the intended ending. There was another ending that was actually shot, and I can understand. I'll be honest, I can understand these notes. It's not the most ramped up of endings. You don't have to have a big action ending, but it is a little bit cinematically a bit of a damp squib ending. So they actually did reshoot an ending where Kinderman again is brought to the point of belief and goes to the cell and actually kills the Gemini because the Gemini is inhabiting the body of Father Karras, his old friend, so he's trying to free the spirit of his old friend. So an act of murder, I guess, or euthanasia. We're on very dicey moral ground here. That was shot, but again not used because Morgan Creek said, hang on a minute, this film is called The Exorcist. There isn't even a fucking exorcism in it. There has to be an exorcism in this film. Now, Blatty didn't want this film to be called Exorcist 3 at all. He wanted it to be called Legion, I believe. I would prefer it to be called Legion. Would actually fit quite nicely now in with Dominion, but that's by the by. Hindsight and all of that. So Morgan Creek said that they threw him a few extra dollars with a few extra zeros at the end of it, and made him rewrite the finale and reshoot it. So he put an exorcism in at the end. If everyone thinks that this priest pops up towards the end, even though he's kind of foreshadowed in it, but he has no interconnection with the rest of the story at all. So if anyone watches it who thinks, well, this guy's just popped up and now he's doing an exorcism, that's why. Because Morgan Creek insisted that there should be an exorcism in it. Blatty didn't want it. The one thing that Morgan Creek did insist on, which I will support, and I will actually say that the outcome of this is an improvement on what would have been, is that they wanted a familiar face from the original. So they insisted that Jason Miller be cast as the patient. It kind of makes sense anyway. He's supposed to look like Karras. He's supposed to look so strikingly like Karras that Kinderman suspects that this is the body of his former friend. So it does kind of make sense to cast the guy that played him originally. Luckily, they were so impressed with what Brad Dourif did as well that they were happy for him to reshoot his scenes as well. So you get this absolutely wonderful making the best of both worlds that Blatty could possibly have done, whereby both actors play the part, and sometimes we're seeing Venom and sometimes we're seeing Karras, and that is such a strong effect and such a strong evocation and representation of what this character looks like physically and what he's like inside spiritually. And sometimes you can see Venom and sometimes you can see Karras. I wouldn't have that any other way. So whilst the exorcism ending is a little hokey, do you know what? I'm going to give Morgan Creek a pass on that, because some of their other interference gave us this wonderful dual role of Patient X, Gemini, Karras, and I can't see the film any other way without that, with one performance or the other. It has to be both for me. It's perfect. Anyone who knows anything about horror movies will tell you that there's a moment in this film which has become almost cult-like in its status. Whilst this film, I believe, within the horror community and critically wider than that, has gained some traction over the years and is actually starting to get the props it deserves. There are some people who really pull for this movie, quite rightly. This is such a strong sequel. There are people who will tell you that there is a moment in this movie that I'm not going to spoil. They call it a jump scare. Some people refer to it as the greatest jump scare in horror cinema. That's not accurate, and it's unfair to what Blatty does in this scene, because a jump scare just kind of comes out of nowhere, and you know, that kind of trash. It used to be a cat jumping out of a cupboard. Now it's these days it's someone opening a bathroom cabinet with a mirror on it and then closing it, and someone's in the reflection. Oh no! The way Blatty toys with you and teases you and lets you know that something is coming. This is the first Exorcist movie I went to see at the cinema. It was released in 1990, so I was 15, so it was the first one I got the chance to sneak into. This moment, whoa, I leapt out of my seat. I'm not afraid to admit it. This is what we're always after, horror fans. The true scares, the properly scary films, the diamonds in the rough, these moments where it works and they get us. My goodness. Blatty got me then. I won't go into any more details, but I just had to touch briefly upon that most joyous moment in horror cinema. Within such a strong film that deals with faith and science and impossibility and the occult and loss and murder, and is there anything good in this unending grind of life, and could the possibility of coming face to face with the embodiment of absolute supernatural evil actually drive you to the conclusion that there is an overarching force for good. I mentioned in video 1, part 1, that the final shot of this movie was a sunset. It bookmarks beautifully the opening shot of an Iraqi sunrise in William Friedkin's The Exorcist. If you only watch 2 Exorcist movies in your lifetime, watch The Exorcist and Exorcist III, and maybe even call it Legion rather than Exorcist III. Next and finally, we're going to look at the curious case of 2 Exorcist prequels, both telling roughly the same story, and this is an example of Morgan Creek finding themselves up the creek with 2 different paddles. I'm stretching this metaphor too far. We're going to have a look at the 2 Exorcist prequels, and we're going to stroke our chins about what could possibly come in the forthcoming Exorcist TV series. And I'm going to give the makers of that TV series the benefit of my advice, not that they'll listen. Until then, save your servant.